In December of 2016, the owners of the Cog Railway announced a plan to build a hotel about a half a mile from the summit of Mount Washington, at an elevation of about 5,600 feet, near the location of this image. While this is the latest attempt to build a hotel on or near a summit of a white mountain, it is certainly not the first. While the appeal still exists to build in these places, the history of previous hotels isn't great. Let's take a look at these previous structures and see how they fared. Naturally, being the tallest mountain, Mount Washington was where the first attempt of a formal hotel was built. It was built in 1852, with another one being built the next year in 1853. These structures were the Summit House and the Tip Top House. The first Summit House could accommodate 60 guests overnight, with a dining room capable of holding up to 150 people. In 1873, the second and enlarged Summit House opened and remained in operation until a large fire in 1908 destroyed nearly everything on top of Mount Washington. The now abandoned Tip Top House survived the 1908 fire and was restored back to a hotel after. When the Summit House was rebuilt several years after the burning, the Tip Top House went up in flames and was rebuilt as an annex to the Summit House. In 1964, the state of New Hampshire bought the Summit House property and replaced the building with a visitor center, which is what stands there today. As for the Tip Top House, it was abandoned again in 1968 and then restored as a historic site. All of that was just Mount Washington. There are several other mountains where hotels have been built. While the first formal attempt of a hotel was on Mount Washington, the first attempt to accommodate overnight visitors was on Mount Kearsarge North in the late 1840s. At that time, 4 people built a small hotel, which was operated for several years before being abandoned. In 1869, a man bought the structure, restored it, and ran it until it blew over in 1883. He tried again, building a smaller building known as the Second Kearsarge House, but he abandoned it after a few years. At one point in the late 1800s, a railroad was planned to bring people to the top of Kearsarge. It never began construction. The railroad company also planned to build a large hotel on top. Another hotspot for building was Mount Moosilauke. In 1860, the Prospect House was built atop the mountain. A carriage road was built to bring more visitors and clients to the summit and its hotel. The hotel was expanded in the 1870s, but it burned down in 1942. This mountain also got a plan to build a railroad to the top. In 1889, the Moosilauke Railroad was incorporated, but was never built. It doesn't stop there. A one-room log house was built on Mount Moriah in the late 1850s. It lasted a short time, and that's really all that anyone knows about it today. A shelter was built on the summit of Mount Lafayette in the late 1850s to early 1860s. There has been mentions of a house on the summit in guides that were published in the 1860s and 70s. A book called Chronicles of the White Mountains says the house was gone by 1875, but that is unconfirmed. In any case, the house is gone today. The Peak House on Mount Chocorua was likely built after the completion of a toll road in 1888. The Peak House wasn't much. However, in the early 1890s, 2 people bought the rights to the road and the Peak House. They built a 3-story hotel, which blew over in 1915. A cabin was constructed at the Peak House and lasted until 1932, when the roof was blown off. So there you have it. 13 instances of hotels and cabins. Out of the 13, one of them is still standing, a small cabin on Mount Chicora that was rebuilt. As you probably noticed, most of this activity was in the 1800s. Things slowed down in the 20th century mainly because the White Mountain National Forest was established in 1918. The only real building in the 1900s was the construction of 7 AMC huts, from the Carter Notch in 1914 to the Mizpah Spring Hut in 1964. As I mentioned at the beginning, the COG Railway has plans to build a hotel on Mount Washington. History of previous hotels isn't great. In fact, it's pretty bad. The odds may be stacked against them, but the appeal of building on mountains will apparently always exist.